17 years ago, Hillary Clinton, then the First Lady, said women's rights cannot be separated from human rights. Nearly 2 decades later, how far have we come? Well, joining us now for more on the state of global women's rights, Liesl Gerntholtz. She is director of the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. And we welcome you up to Toronto and to TVO.
Thank you, Steve.
It's nice to meet you. Look over my shoulder at the monitor because we're going to play some of that very famous speech that Hillary Clinton gave back in 1995 at the UN Fourth World Conference on Women. Roll tape.
I believe that now, on the eve of a new millennium, it is time to break the silence. It is time for us to say here in Beijing, and for the world to hear, that it is no longer acceptable to discuss women's rights as separate from human rights. If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
That was a very powerful statement when she made that for the first time back then. Where did that notion of women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights come from in the first place?
Well, at the time, I mean, and it's a very, as you say, a very powerful statement. And to look back now, I think we take for granted in many respects now that people do see women's rights as part of human rights. But at the time, there were huge issues that had been left by the international community. So, for example, domestic violence was seen very much as something that was happening in the private sphere, that governments had no role to play in preventing or responding to it. So what had happened in Beijing had sort of been the culmination of a couple of years of advocacy, both nationally but also internationally, where women's groups had gotten together and had sort of begun this idea that we really couldn't talk about human rights as separate from women's rights.
And when she said it, it sounded like a radical concept to a lot of people.
It was a radical concept in its day. It certainly was.
Not anymore, obviously.
I think not anymore, to the extent that there have been huge progress has been made around many issues. I mean, if you think about, for example, women's participation in public life, you have women leaders. You have 2 countries in Africa that are led by women. You have many countries that have mechanisms to advance women's participation in parliament, in lawmaking. You've had a huge focus on violence against women. We take for granted now that many countries have laws against domestic violence, that they have shelters, that they have trained police officers, that they have specialized medical services. But when she made that speech, very little of that was in place. So there has certainly been progress, I think. But I think there's a lot left to do.
Sure, and you talk about the political progress, and I was going to get to this later, but since you brought it up now, can I do this now, Control Room? Let's go to page 2 here. Here's a chart showing a number of different countries and the percentage of women's participation in politics. And, you know, nobody would get this if you asked what's the country in the world where more women participate in the legislative affairs of the country than any other. Rwanda, number 1. Andorra, number 2. Cuba, number 3, nearly half. Sweden, number 4. The Seychelles, number 5, still just almost half the participation. Finland comes in at 6. South Africa, there's your native land, at number 7, 42%. Where's Canada? We are well down the list. 25% rather, of our parliamentarians are female. And the United States is even worse. 17% of their congressional representatives are female. You did point out that there are a couple of countries in the world, I guess, where or I should say 17 countries out of about 200, I think is the last chart, where the woman is either head of government or head of state or both. But when you look at those numbers, what do you infer?
I infer that progress has been made because I think if you go back 50 or 60 years, you would have seen no women in parliaments as heads of government in any kind of key leadership positions across both public and private sectors. So I think, well, firstly, I think if you care about women's rights, you have to play the long game. It's incremental changes. It doesn't happen overnight. So in some respects, I look at those figures and I feel incredibly optimistic that change is unstoppable, that we will continue to see the number of women increasing in Parliament as leaders of government. But I do think it's very significant that those top 5 countries are largely in the developing world. Because I think in this respect, it's been the developing world that has perhaps led the charge to put more women in those positions, and that many of the developed world that we have looked upon to play a leadership role in women's rights have not kept pace with some of the progress that has been made.
Don't you find that odd? I mean, we in the West think we're so superior in so many ways to the developing world, but look how far ahead they are on this scale. It really is something, isn't it?
Well, I think we're looking at a very particular aspect of the problem, because I think in terms of women's political participation, Beijing, one of the things that came out of Beijing was a suggestion that quotas and a 33%, they called it a critical mass, was used. And of course, you had a lot of transition happening in places like Africa and Asia at the time. So there was space, you know, there were new governments forming, there were changes to electoral systems. So in some respects, those places had an opportunity to look at the recommendations coming out of Beijing and try to figure out how to implement them. You know, in places like the US and Canada, you have electoral systems that are really, in some respects, cast in stone. Very little changes happen to them. And I think in those places it's more difficult. But I think the barriers that women face, both in the West and in the developing countries, are often quite similar.
Do you think we need something in, since I'll pick on the 2 countries lowest on that list that we published there, do we need something in Canada or the United States which mandates a floor for female participation in politics?
You know, I would argue yes, because I think the figures speak for themselves. In both countries where you have high levels of educated women, where progress has been made in terms of getting women into universities, into non-traditional employment, the fact that you still have very low levels of women in politics, I think speaks to some of the barriers that women face in making it in politics. You know, I remember in South Africa, one of the things that struck women when they entered the first post-apartheid parliament was that there were no women's toilets in the parliament. They had to go down to the basement. So I think that they're both sort of these very small things, but they have a chilling effect on women. I think there are big structural barriers as well. You know, if you are responsible for childcare, it's hard to go out and canvass for votes.
Sure.
If you live in a country where women's role is seen as very much as being in the home, bringing up children, it's hard then to create a public role for yourself when many people in your community are telling you it's not appropriate, it's just not done. But I think the numbers say it all, don't they?
Well, here's the key. I'm not sure, because here's a follow-up question that I think is relevant here. Is it a given that if more women participate in the public affairs of their countries, that women in general, their well-being will improve in those countries? You
know, there's not a huge body of research on it, and that's partly because it is such a new phenomenon. But what there is suggests that where you have more women in government, you tend, not always, but you tend to have better policies for women. You tend to have policies that promote women's safety. You tend to have policies that promote women's participation in public life. You tend to have policies that recognize the barriers that women experience. We don't know enough about it. What we do know is that women have a right. They're 50% of the population, so they have a right to participate. And there is a suggestion that having them is better than not having them, certainly for women.
Well, they certainly have a right to participate here, but many are not availing themselves of that right for a whole bunch of reasons which are, well, anyway, which are another show, in fact. So let me double back here. Let me double back, because Hillary Clinton also, in that speech that she gave back in 1995, detailed a litany of abuses against women, everything from sexual violence, genital mutilation, honor killings. We know the list. It's horrendous. How much progress do you think has been made worldwide in terms of recognizing how unacceptable those things are?
Progress has been made in recognizing that they're unacceptable. Not enough progress has been made in reducing the numbers of women and girls who experience those violations. I think if we look at, for example, something like early marriage, and it is so clear that early and child marriage not only stop girls from being educated, from realizing their full potential, but these are violations that follow adult women into their lives.
I got numbers on this too, Liesl. Can I just put these up here? The UN Population Fund estimates if current trends continue, the number of child brides marrying each year will have grown from 14.2 million from a couple of years ago, 14.2, to 15.1 million by the year 2030. Another almost million young girls being forced to marry young.
And
what are the implications?
So many implications. Almost inevitably it interrupts and almost inevitably stops their education, So girls who get married don't go back to school. That means when they're adults, they're virtually unemployable. They don't have skills that allow them to work. There's a high correlation between child marriage and domestic violence. And you can imagine young women, young girls going into a new household, and they're subject often to violence not just at the hands of their spouses, but by their extended family members. Also, huge reproductive health problems. The earlier you have sex, the earlier you get pregnant, the less likely you are firstly to survive childbirth, and the more likely you are to have ongoing reproductive health problems.
Can I just understand this? Child bride means what age?
We have investigated child marriage in a number of countries. In Yemen, we were talking to girls and women who'd been married at the age of 10. So, you know, you're talking really from very young girls to adolescents who are 15 and 16 years old. So it depends on where you go, but you know, some places you have girls who are barely out of puberty, and in fact, who have not yet reached puberty, who are being married off.
In which countries based on your research, do women still have it the worst off?
You know, that's a really hard question to answer because there are many, you know, for example, if you think about the Democratic Republic of Congo, I think many people are familiar with the extraordinary high levels of sexual violence that have taken place in that conflict. So for many people, that's a pretty awful place for women to live. If you think about a place like Afghanistan, where women have been deprived of education, they continue to experience high levels of child marriage, of various forms of violence. So I think it depends really on how you define that. But, you know, I've seen many different polls. I saw a poll that that said this year that India was a really awful place for women to live. So it depends on the measurements.
Well, let's follow up with this. Can you tell us what countries are demonstrating, in your judgment, the political will to combat this?
There has been a movement in Africa that has, I think, started with a willingness and a desire to include women in decision-making, and not just at the level of national politics, which is important, but also at the level of communities and districts and state levels. So I think that has been very important, because I think what we do know is that change begins when women have a role in making decisions about what kind of change is important, what the issues are that they need to be addressed. So I think we've certainly seen progress in Africa around increasing the number of women who are in decision-making positions. We've seen a huge response to violence against women across the board. Even in the Middle East countries, you have seen movement on challenging things like honor killings, so-called honor killings. So I think there has been progress, and as I said earlier, you know, as having been somebody who's worked in women's rights for a lot of my adult life, you have to be willing to really look at this as a long-term project.
Long-term meaning?
Certainly I hope that my daughter, who's 11 now, will be seeing the benefits of the work that's been done now. But I don't anticipate in my lifetime that we will see the eradication of all forms of inequality.
No, of course.
But if I think about my own mother, and I think about sort of in the 50s when she grew up in South Africa, there were no women in parliament, there were no women who ran companies, there were no women certainly who sort of had a major role in public life. It's a very different scenario that I face, and as I said, I hope my daughter will have a very different world when she's an adult.
Different scenario, but let me try this, because you've heard this before. Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir were all strong, important, in historical terms, women leaders of their respective countries, all of whom went to war, despite the fact that they were women leaders, for a variety of reasons, of course. Do we have to be careful in making the assumption that the higher up women go on the political ladder, it automatically means that this world is going to be a kinder, gentler place as a result of it?
Yes, I think we should be careful of making that assumption. The Australians have a term for it. They call it rolling up the ladder, and they talk about sort of women, particularly I think women who've really struggled to get to the top. That, you know, there is the sense that women are gentler, more compassionate, and that they will in fact then work with younger women to improve or make their access to those positions easier, and in fact that doesn't always happen. I mean, I think we should be very careful to stereotype women in the same way as we've done men, that women are just automatically more compassionate leaders, don't like war, will take care of the children and the elderly and the sick. I don't think that's necessarily true.
Okay, moving on. I'm going to read you something that Egyptian-American activist Mona El-Tahawi wrote in foreignpolicy.com. She wrote this earlier this year about women in the Muslim world. She said, "When it comes to the status of women in the Middle East, it's not better than you think. It's much, much worse. So tell us how you would characterize the kind of abuse that women are still experiencing regardless of the Arab Spring.
I think that women living under Muslim personal laws face many legal barriers to their full equality. So, for example, you have a range of laws that regulate some of the most intimate portions of their life, marriage, divorce, child custody, that really discriminate against them as women. So in many Arab countries, for example, fathers automatically get custody of children, regardless of whether they're the better parent. The test in many other countries in the world is the best interests of the child. There, it's kind of a blanket, children belong with the father. So I think that Muslim personal laws are a very problematic aspect of sort of the legal regime under which women live in the Middle East. I think honor killing, something that I think sometimes has been sensationalized by the Western media, but I think this concept of honor, that women are the custodians of honor, that women have to behave in a way that protects families' honor. You know, you continue to see reports all over the Muslim world of women who are at risk of honor-related violence. You know, I was speaking to somebody who's been working in the camps in Turkey, so there are large numbers of Syrian refugees who have left because of the conflict. And there are women there who've been subject to sexual violence in the conflict, and many of them feel at risk of honor-related violence. We interviewed women during the Libya conflict who had been raped by Gaddafi soldiers and who told us of their fears that their family would murder them, that they would be at risk of domestic violence because they were now seen as damaged goods. So I think there are particular issues in the Middle East, but I would not like to overstate the case that women living in the Middle East have it worse than anywhere else.
Why, all these years later, I know we've looked through history and rape has always been I want to be careful how I say this. Some male soldiers have felt it within their rights to use rape as both a means of combat and as a to the victors go the spoils kind of attitude. 21st century now. Why is this attitude still out there?
Well, I think because you have high levels of gender inequality in those places. So before the conflict, you have fairly high levels of violence against women. You have women who are seen as second-class citizens. In many of those countries, for example, marital rape is not recognized as a crime. So that, you know, sexual violence in conflict doesn't take place in isolation. It takes place in a pre-existing context, and very often that context is marked by profound levels of inequality against women. So I think that for me what is interesting, and I think what a lot of researchers are trying to understand, is why sexual violence happens in some conflicts and not others. And you know, that's going to help us understand what we need to do to prevent it and to respond to it.
Let me ask you one last question, and this may not be answerable, but I want to give it a shot anyway. If a girl were born today, a young female baby were born today, what province/state/country would you want that young girl baby to be born in to have the best chance at a, you know what I'm saying? At a gender balanced, equal life?
That's a very difficult question. I would certainly say that Canada would be in my top 5 countries, because I think that Canada has taken, both internally within the country, has really promoted gender equality, and Canadian International Development Aid has been a very, very important tool for activists all over the world to promote women's equality. So I think Canada would be pretty high up there on the list. I would say, because that's where my heart is, that I think South Africa has certainly over the past 20 years put in place a world-class legal and policy framework to promote women's equality. It has yet to address high levels of violence against women, and it has yet to deal with some of the culture that continues to impoverish women's equality. But I think if you were to look at a country that has really gone from very low levels of equality to a country that has a genuine commitment, South Africa would also be, I think, a pretty good place in some respects for a young girl.
Is this a coincidence that you've mentioned my country and your country here?
No, I think that there are genuine reasons
Okay,
for that.
Just checking. Liesl Gerntholtz, the Director of Women's Rights Division for Human Rights Watch. It's good of you to visit us at TVO tonight. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.